What's up, everyone? Today we're going to continue talking about Azure Functions and dive a little bit deeper into input and output bindings. We'll create a couple of different functions that interact with different Azure services. We can see how we can do that natively and really easily, especially when using PowerShell and our push output binding commandlet. My name is Jeff. This is Jeff Brown Tech. Let's go ahead and get started. I was trying to come up with a somewhat real-world scenario where you could use different functions to interact with each other in some different services, and I decided on creating an order processing system. What we'll do is we'll have an HTTP trigger. It will accept an incoming request to it, and it'll go create a message out into a message queue. We'll then have another function that picks up messages in that queue whenever they arrive. We'll use it to create an invoice file. We'll save out into Blob storage and then an entry into a table. In order to provide these other services, I have just a storage account here because it meets all those requirements, but obviously you can use other things. To get started, we'll place a message into our orders queue here. You can see I currently have a message sitting right there from an example earlier. And then our other function will pick up messages inside this queue. We'll use it to go create files in our Blob container. And then I have a table here called orders where we'll put entries into also. Okay, with that out of the way, let's switch back to our function app and get started creating our different functions. We'll create a new function here. It'll be an HTTP trigger, just as we did before in the first video. We will rename this to incoming order. We'll leave the authorization level at function and go ahead and create. Before we jump into the code, let's go over to our integration tab and modify some of our settings here. I want to rename the HTTP trigger just because I want it to be a little more descriptive. We'll call this HTTP request in. We won't have a route template, function authorization level, and we'll change this to a post method. Okay, we'll go ahead and save that. And then let's go to our response. I'm going to call this HTTP response out. Next, we need to add the output to place a message into our queue service. We'll go ahead and select add output. We'll change our binding type over to Azure Queue Storage. Now we need to authenticate so we can actually interact with this other service. And in order to do that, we need to do a storage account connection. This existing one here for Azure Web Job Storage, that actually connects to the storage account associated with our function app where we store all the files and everything that run our functions. I would recommend creating a different storage account if you're going to be interacting with, in this case, where queue services or files or anything, and just leave that other storage account alone so it's dedicated strictly to your function app. We'll go ahead and create a new storage account connection. We can see all our storage accounts here. We just took a look at our storage account on this one. And all right, so it's creating a new storage account connection for us. We'll change our parameter name of how we'll access it inside of our code. I'm going to add just order queue item. And the name of our queue is orders queue. We saw that earlier when we went over the storage account. Okay, this all looks good. Let me go ahead and click on add. Okay, and there we have it. So again, just to reiterate, we have our incoming HTTP trigger. It's going to have some order information in it. We'll then process our function and it will send back an HTTP response just so we know the order was received and it worked and it went through. And then we're going to place an item out into our queue storage to be processed by another function. Okay, let's go back to the code and test tab here. I'm going to minimize logs just so I have more room on the screen. And we'll take out most of this code here. We'll leave our push output binding here at the bottom. And then I do need to rename some of our parameters here. So this is going to be HTTP request in. Now this is matching up with the names on our integration tab that we just set up. And on this one, it will be HTTP response out. Next, I'm going to paste in some code here and then we'll go over it just so you don't have to sit here and watch me type everything. First, I'm going to create a variable, just body, and set it to null. Actually, I want to change that and just set it to an empty string because we are going to potentially change its value as we move forward here. Now, next, I'm creating a hash table called order details. It will have 3 keys in it: customer ID, zip code, and total. And then those values are HTTP request in, .body, .customer ID. So again, we're looking at this here. This variable matches up with here, which is our incoming HTTP trigger. It has a property called body, which holds JSON information typically. We'll see that here in an example. And then in that JSON body, we're going to have all this information for our order: the customer ID, the zip code, and the total. Next, going through and just creating a unique order number, getting the timestamp of year, month, day, hour, minute, seconds down to the milliseconds, and a random 4-digit number. We're putting that all together. And then we're adding that to our orders hash table. The key is order number, and then our value is our order number that we're generating here, just to make sure it's unique. Then we're outputting to the screen, processing the order, sending a queue message. And then here, we're going to create another variable just called message. We're going to convert our order details hash table over to JSON, and then compress, just gets rid of all the white space and everything. And then we'll use our push output binding command. We're familiar with that from the first video. And instead, this time, we're not going to push an HTTP response just yet. We're going to reference our order queue item that's going to place a message out in our queue. And the value of that is going to be message. I'm going to set body equal to saying, this order number was processed successfully, and output that to the screen. And then again, we need to send a response back to whoever, put in this HTTP request. And then we'll use push output binding there, status code okay, and then body equals our body variable. Now, there could be a lot more error handling here, maybe making sure that each of these has a value in it, or that they're included in the JSON body. Maybe some try catches around our push output binding just to make sure the message gets out to our queue. But for right now, I'm really just trying to focus on working with these different bindings and everything. Again, this code could use some improvement, but for right now, we're going to leave it as is. Okay, go ahead and save that, and let's go over to test and run and put in some information here. Leave all that the same. Let me scroll back up here because we're going to line this up here. Now, this is the body of our HTTP request. So the first thing we need to take a look at is customer ID. Do that. And the next piece of information is zip code. And then our total, say 229.45. Now again, this is our JSON body that's in our HTTP request. And this customer ID here is on our body, so that matches up here. The zip code goes here, and this total will then be part of here and be assigned out into our hash table. So that's where these interacts come in. This body here corresponds to that body there in our HTTP request. All right, let's go ahead and run this, and hopefully it works the first time. Okay, it did come back and say 200 okay, which is going to be our only response here, even if something did go wrong. Could also, again, use some improvement there. But we do see an order was successfully processed. If we go back out to our storage account and go into our orders queue, we'll probably see 2 of them here now. Okay, yeah, and we see the zip code there and that customer number and everything. So yeah, that worked perfectly. We have our function there. We had an incoming HTTP request, it processed it, put a message out into our queue as expected. Perfect. Now back here in our function app, let's go ahead and close this. And let's go back to the main screen here. Did not take me back where I wanted. Okay, we have our second HTTP trigger going on here, but now we need another one that's going to look for messages in that queue. And we'll go through and process them. We'll go ahead and create another function. And here we have Azure Queue Storage Trigger function that will run whenever a message is added to a specified storage queue. Perfect. That sounds like what we need. And let's call this process order queue trigger. Our queue name is going to be orders queue. That's what we saw earlier in our storage account. And we need to select that same storage account connection that we created earlier and go ahead and create. All right, we have some default code here again, but let's always get back started with our integration. I'm going to go change the name of our queue storage trigger here. This again is how we'll reference it inside of our code. We'll say order queue inbound. Our queue name is staying the same. We'll save that. And let's add some additional outputs. We're going to create an invoice file out to our Blob storage. So our binding type is already Blob storage. We need to select our storage account. And we'll rename this to output invoice blob. And I'm going to change the name of this container here that'll create orders. The file name will be a random GUID and .txt. Now for this push output binding commandlet and inside of PowerShell, this path file here, there's not a lot of options that you can do. I would rather put these in containers based on the customer ID, and then each invoice would be the name. The name of the invoice would be the order number, but there's just limitations here. But I think I can overcome that. Instead of using a storage account connection and the push output binding, we could use manage identities and other PowerShell commands directly. We'll probably do that in another video, but for right now, just taking a look at this on the output binding, this is just some of the limitations with PowerShell, and we're just going to leave it as that for right now. Okay, and then we need to also add an entry into our table. We'll do another output binding here. Azure table storage. Select our storage account connection. Our output here is going to be orders table output, and the name of our table is orders. Add that. All right, looking good. So again, we're going to look for a message in our queue storage. We'll have it processed inside of our function. Then we're going to create a file out in our blob storage and then an entry into our table storage. Let's go back to code and test. Need to update the name of our queue item that we're looking for here, how we reference it. So that is just going to be order queue inbound. Just do a quick find and replace to change this. We'll leave these defaults up here because it's just outputting information about the message and our trigger metadata. Again, let me paste in some code here and get rid of our logs just so we can see more things here. And let's go over what we're going to do here. We're going to take each of the properties in our message and just assign it to individual variables just to work with it a little bit easier. Inside of our message queue, it is stored in JSON, but when it comes through here inside the PowerShell function, it's a hash table. We just need to reference order queue inbound, which matches our incoming parameter, and just each key to assign it into its variable. Next, going to just generate invoice text here, just basic 4 lines that we're going to put in our text file, just have some type of content to put into it. Next thing we'll do is we'll create the invoice file. Again, we've got push output binding, and then we'll reference output invoice blob. That's the name of our output that we just did on the integration tab. And the value for the file is going to be our invoice text variable. Then we're going to create an entry into our orders table. Again, push output binding, the name of our output binding, which is orders table output, and the value of the record that we're putting in there. The partition key doesn't have to be unique all in the table, but that is how you group things together, group the different entries together. So that's going to be the customer ID. But then within each partition key, you do need a unique row key. So that's going to be the order number. That should be unique because it's based on timestamp information. And then our zip code and total. And then finally, here at the very end, we'll just say the order number was processed successfully. Real quick, let's go back into our queue message here because we have a couple sitting here and I'm going to copy their information. Sorry, this is automatically blurred out. I have an extension to block out sensitive information, so it must think this is sensitive, but I'm going to copy this to my clipboard. We'll save this. We'll do test and run. Let me bring logs back up here. And our sample data that we're going to take a look at is our JSON body with all of our order information, including our order number. So we'll go ahead and run this. Did come back and say accepted. See it go through. There's some warnings there about the blob not existing, but it goes through and fixes that. All right, so let's jump back out to our storage account. Let's go under blob containers. We now have an orders container here. Let's expand this out so we can see a little bit better. And we can see it just created a file for us. Let's actually go into the file real quick just to make sure it has the content that we're looking for. We'll go ahead and download and open this file. We can see it has our order number and customer information, all that good stuff that we included when we were processing the function. And then let's go out into our orders table and we should see an entry here. Our partition key is the customer number. Our row key is the order number. Then we have our total and zip code. So perfect. Ran through, we were able to test that and it went and did the outputs that we were expecting. So awesome, looking really good here. So let's actually go back through and test it multiple times and actually calling it via PowerShell. So let's go back to our function app. I do need to go get the URL for our HTTP trigger here. So let's go back into it. We'll get the function URL. Remember, we did set authorization on this. We do need some type of either the function app key or the function key, which is specific to the function. I'm going to copy this to my clipboard and let's jump out to PowerShell and do an example of calling this multiple times. Out here in PowerShell, I just took that function URL and I saved it to a variable called URI. Not displaying it just because it has a function app key into it. I'll probably rotate that anyway before you see this video, but just to let you know, I went ahead and did that. Next, I'm going to paste in here an array of multiple order information. So we have zip code, total, and customer ID, just a bunch of hash tables. Now, when calling an API or anything like that, you typically have to inform, what information or what format you're sending the data over. And that is going to be inside of headers. So I'm going to create a headers variable here, setting the content type to application JSON. Now, if we go into orders, pull this in here from my history, I'm going to pipe that over and do a for each. Going to invoke REST method. The method is going to be post. Our URI is that URI variable that I already just saved. We're going to take the information inside that hash table, convert it to JSON, and reference our headers, just letting know this is coming over in JSON format. Before I do that, let me jump back over here to the function app. Let's go into log stream. And this will show this connecting out of the application insights and it's just going to do a log of all the things that the different functions are doing as they're being processed. So we should see a whole bunch of information come through here in a second. All right, so we'll go ahead and execute this and hopefully, it's coming back and saying the order is successfully processed. See a whole bunch of information come through. If we jump back to our orders queue, okay. Lucky enough there, caught it in time. We can see our 20 orders that we just placed. And if we go through and refresh, we'll take just a second. That other function's probably spinning up and starting to process. Perfect. So went to 0 there. And if we go over to orders, we now see we have a lot more order or invoices here that it created with our random GUID as the file name. And if we go over to tables and orders, we can see it's filled up with a lot more order information. So perfect. We placed a whole bunch of orders. That first function placed messages into our queue, and then our other function picked up those messages from the queue and created our orders table entries and created our invoice files. So perfect. Hopefully that illustrates how you can chain these things together, have functions trigger off other events or things that are going on, and have different output bindings. It's not always a one-to-one thing. You don't have to have one input, one output, get it doing multiple things for you. Before we finish up here, I do want to go back to the function app. And we created that storage account connection earlier. I just want to show you where that lives in case you ever need to go change anything with it. If you go under settings and environment variables, we can see right here, we have JPT, we have the name of our storage account and underscore storage. That's what we created earlier. And the value here does have an access key in it in order to authenticate over to the other storage account. So if you ever went and rotated those keys in that storage account, you would have to come back over here and update this value here. Easier way, like I mentioned earlier, would probably be managed identities. I'll cover that in probably the next video, and how you can use a Function App managed identity to interact with your other Azure services. That does it for this video. Hopefully that helps maybe cement the idea of how you can use multiple input and output bindings like that in your triggers to create different functions. It doesn't always have to be a timer or an HTTP trigger, queue off things going into a storage queue or blob, or even when files are created. Lots of different options there. All right, thank you for watching this video, and we'll see you next time.